She dumped me, saying I lacked ambition. I found out she was marrying a millionaire. I crashed the wedding with his ex-fiancée. 3 years. 3 whole years of my life I gave to someone who apparently saw me as nothing more than a placeholder until something better came along. The breakup happened on a Tuesday evening in March, right after I'd made her favorite pasta dish, the one with the roasted vegetables she always claimed nobody else could make quite right. I remember standing there in our tiny kitchen, wooden spoon still in my hand, as she delivered her carefully rehearsed speech about how we were growing in different directions and how I lacked the drive to build a real future. The worst part wasn't even the words themselves. It was the way she said them, like she'd been practicing in the mirror for weeks. Cold, clinical, final. She'd already packed her things. I noticed later that her favorite coffee mug was gone from the cabinet, her bathroom products cleared out, her side of the closet empty except for a few old sweaters she never wore anyway. She'd been planning this exit strategy while I was still thinking about where we might go for our anniversary next month. I spent the following weeks in that weird limbo that comes after a long relationship ends. You know the feeling. When you wake up and for just a split second everything feels normal, then reality crashes down like a bucket of ice water. I'd reach for my phone to text her about something funny I saw. Then remember. I'd buy 2 coffees out of habit, then drink both myself and feel sick. Our apartment felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. My friends tried their best to help. They took me out to bars where the music was too loud and the drinks too expensive. They set me up on awkward coffee dates with their coworkers' sisters and college roommates. They told me all the right things, that I deserved better, that she didn't know what she was losing, that everything happens for a reason. But none of it stuck. I felt like I was going through the motions of moving on without actually getting anywhere. Then came the Instagram post that changed everything. It was a Friday night about a month after the breakup. I was in my pajamas at 8 p.m., eating cereal for dinner and scrolling mindlessly through social media. Probably not the healthiest coping mechanism, but we all have our moments. That's when I saw it. A photo of her hand wearing the most enormous diamond ring I'd ever seen outside of a jewelry store window. The caption was simple. He asked. I said yes, followed by way too many heart emojis. My cereal went soggy as I stared at that screen. The math didn't add up. 1 month. She'd gotten engaged exactly 1 month after telling me she needed to focus on herself and figure out what she really wanted. The comments section was full of congratulations from friends and family, people asking about wedding dates and venues. Her sister had commented, finally, which made my stomach twist in ways I didn't want to analyze. I did what any rational person would do in that situation. I went down the rabbit hole. Through her tagged photos, I found his profile. Tech entrepreneur, judging by his bio. His feed was exactly what you'd expect. Shots of expensive cars, fancy restaurants, vacation photos from places that probably cost more per night than I made in a month. The kind of lifestyle that screamed, I have ambition in a way that apparently my steady job and small apartment couldn't compete with. But here's where it gets interesting. As I scrolled through his posts, I noticed something odd. Up until about 2 months ago, all his couple photos featured a different woman. Blonde, elegant, always perfectly dressed. The kind of woman who looked like she belonged in those expensive restaurants and luxury hotel lobbies. Then suddenly, she vanished from his feed entirely, replaced by photos with my ex. The timeline was becoming clearer, and it wasn't pretty. I spent the weekend in detective mode, which probably wasn't healthy but felt necessary. Through mutual friends and some careful social media stalking, I pieced together more of the story. This guy had been in a long-term relationship, practically engaged according to some old posts I found. Then boom, radio silence, and suddenly he's with someone new. Someone who apparently had been telling me she needed space to grow as a person while she was actually growing into someone else's life. Update 1. I couldn't let it go. I know, I should have just blocked them both and moved on with my life. But something about the whole situation felt so calculated, so deliberately cruel, that I couldn't just pretend it hadn't happened. She'd made me feel like I was the problem, like I was somehow inadequate, when the truth was she'd just found a better offer. Through a friend of a friend of a friend. You know how these things work in a city where everyone's connected by about 2 degrees of separation. I managed to get in touch with the blonde woman from his old photos. Her name was Claire, and when I reached out to her through a carefully crafted message explaining who I was and why I was contacting her, her response came back within an hour. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown on a Wednesday afternoon. I was nervous in a way I hadn't been since high school, constantly checking my appearance in every reflective surface I passed. What do you wear to meet your replacement's replacement? I went with casual but put together, jeans and a nice sweater that my sister always said brought out my eyes. Claire was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her hands wrapped around a large coffee cup. She was even more beautiful in person than in photos, but there was something tired about her eyes, a kind of exhaustion I recognized from my own mirror. We exchanged awkward hellos and ordered drinks, both of us clearly trying to figure out how to start this conversation. The ice broke when she said she'd been wondering if someone like me existed. Apparently, the timeline of her breakup had seemed suspicious too. Her ex had suddenly become distant, started working late more often, claimed he needed space to focus on some big project. The classic playbook, really. Then one day, he sat her down and delivered what sounded like a very similar speech to the one I'd received, about growing apart, about needing different things, about how it wasn't her fault, but they just weren't compatible anymore. We spent 3 hours in that coffee shop, comparing notes like investigators working a case. The dates matched up perfectly. While I was making dinner and planning anniversaries, he was apparently planning his exit strategy. While she was looking at wedding venues and thinking about their future, he was already building a different one behind her back. But here's what really got to both of us, the way we'd been made to feel like the problem. She told me how he'd criticized her spending, called her materialistic, said she didn't understand the pressure he was under with his work. Meanwhile, he was apparently telling my ex that she deserved better, that she should be with someone who could really provide for her, someone with real ambition and drive. He'd played us all, made each of us feel inadequate in exactly the way that would make his betrayal feel like our fault. Claire had been dealing with her own version of the post-breakup spiral. She'd thrown herself into work, started working out obsessively, changed her entire wardrobe, trying to become the person she thought she should have been for him. She'd been carrying around this weight of failure, this sense that she'd somehow not been enough. Sitting there with her, I realized how much energy I'd wasted on self-doubt. How many nights I'd laid awake wondering what I could have done differently, what I was lacking that made it so easy for her to walk away. The truth was simpler and somehow worse. There was nothing wrong with either of us. We'd just been inconvenient obstacles to what they really wanted. By the time we left the coffee shop, we'd made a decision that probably wasn't entirely mature or healthy, but felt absolutely necessary. They were getting married in 2 weeks at some fancy venue outside the city. Claire had seen the announcement on social media. Apparently, they weren't being subtle about their whirlwind romance. The whole thing felt like a performance, a way of showing the world how perfect and inevitable their love was. We decided we needed to see this performance for ourselves. Update 2. Planning to crash a wedding is harder than movies make it look. First, there's the practical stuff, figuring out the venue, the timing, what to wear. Then there's the emotional preparation, which is honestly the harder part. What exactly were we trying to accomplish? What was our endgame? Claire and I met several more times over the next 2 weeks, and I started to realize that what we were doing wasn't really about revenge. It was about truth. They'd both rewritten history to make themselves the heroes of their own love story, and we'd been cast as the boring, inadequate exes who just couldn't appreciate what we had. The wedding was going to be the grand finale of that narrative, the perfect couple finally finding each other after escaping their disappointing past relationships. We wanted to be a reminder that the past isn't quite so easily rewritten. The venue was one of those restored barn places that charge ridiculous amounts of money to pretend you're having a rustic wedding while providing all the luxury amenities. We did a drive-by the week before to scope it out. The whole place screamed expensive, manicured grounds, valet parking, the kind of setup that gets featured in wedding magazines. Claire had insider information that proved useful. She knew his family, his friends, his business associates. She knew that his father was heavily invested in his startup, both financially and emotionally. She also knew that his father was old school, traditional, the kind of man who valued loyalty and honesty above pretty much everything else. More importantly, she knew that a lot of the wedding guests already had suspicions about how quickly this relationship had developed. His friends weren't stupid. They'd noticed how fast Claire had disappeared from his life and how quickly she'd been replaced. Some of them had even reached out to Claire privately after the engagement announcement, asking if she was okay, if she knew what had happened. The truth was already out there, waiting in the whispers and raised eyebrows of people who'd known them both. We weren't planning to drop a bombshell so much as light a fuse that was already connected to one. I bought a dress that was probably too expensive for my budget but perfect for what we needed, elegant, sophisticated, the kind of thing that would help me blend in with the country club crowd. Claire had her own strategy worked out. She wasn't trying to hide who she was, quite the opposite. She wanted to be recognized, wanted people to remember her and do the math. The night before the wedding, I barely slept. I kept running through scenarios in my head, imagining all the ways this could go wrong. What if security threw us out immediately? What if we just looked petty and vindictive? What if they were actually happy together and we were the ones who looked foolish? But then I'd remember that Tuesday night in March, standing in my kitchen with a wooden spoon, feeling like I'd somehow failed at being worth loving. I'd remember all the nights I'd spent wondering what was wrong with me, why I wasn't enough. They'd both contributed to that pain, and they'd done it while building their perfect love story on the foundation of our broken hearts. Maybe what we were doing wasn't entirely right, but it felt necessary. Saturday morning came gray and drizzly, which felt appropriate. We met at Claire's apartment to get ready together, partially for moral support, partially because we wanted to make sure we looked like we belonged together. The plan was simple: arrive during the cocktail hour, blend in with the guests, wait for the ceremony. Claire looked stunning in a way that was clearly intentional. Not trying to upstage the bride exactly, but definitely reminding everyone what he'd walked away from. I felt confident in my own skin for the first time in months, partially because of the dress but mostly because of the sense of purpose. We arrived separately but met up in the parking lot. The venue was even more impressive up close, with white flowers everywhere and guests who looked like they'd stepped out of a lifestyle magazine. We took a deep breath and walked in together. The recognition was immediate. I saw heads turn, whispers start, phones come out as people tried to figure out who we were and why we looked familiar. Claire was getting longer stares. People clearly knew her but couldn't quite process why she was there. A few brave souls approached us, making polite conversation while obviously fishing for information. We played it perfectly calm. Yes, we were friends. Yes, we thought it was important to support people during big life moments. No, we weren't staying long. Just wanted to witness the happy occasion. The cocktail hour was surreal. We watched my ex float around in her designer dress, accepting congratulations and showing off her ring. She looked happy in a way I'd never seen before, not just content, but genuinely radiant. For a moment, I wondered if maybe they really were perfect for each other, if maybe this whole thing was just a case of everyone ending up where they belonged. Then I saw him notice Claire. His face went through about 6 different expressions in the span of 3 seconds. Surprise, confusion, panic, anger, and finally a kind of forced calm that didn't reach his eyes. He excused himself from his conversation and started making his way across the room toward us. That's when Claire smiled at me and said it was time for the main event. Final update. The ceremony was held in a restored barn that had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale. Hundreds of white flowers, string lights everywhere, rustic wooden benches that probably cost more than my monthly rent. We found seats toward the back, close to the aisle but not conspicuous. Just 2 well-dressed wedding guests there to celebrate love. I watched my ex walk down the aisle and felt something I wasn't expecting, a kind of peace. She looked beautiful, truly happy, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I wondered if maybe we were making a mistake. Maybe love really is messy and complicated, and maybe people really do leave relationships when they find something better. Maybe that's just how life works. But then I looked at Claire beside me, remembering our conversations about how we'd both been made to feel inadequate, how we'd both been lied to and manipulated, and I remembered why we were there. This wasn't about stopping true love. It was about truth itself. The ceremony was beautiful, I'll give them that. The officiant spoke about love being a choice, about commitment and honesty and building a life together. The groom looked handsome in his expensive suit, and my ex glowed in her designer dress. If you didn't know the backstory, it really did look like a fairy tale wedding. Then came the moment we'd been waiting for. The officiant smiled at the gathered crowd and spoke the words that have probably launched 1,000 dramatic moments. If anyone has a reason why these two should not be wed, speak now or forever hold your peace. It's funny how in movies, this moment always feels dramatic and inevitable. In real life, there's usually just an awkward pause where everyone shifts in their seats and waits for the ceremony to continue. No one ever actually speaks up. Except this time, someone did. Claire stood up slowly, gracefully, like she was simply stretching her legs. Every head in the place turned toward her, and I heard the collective intake of breath from about 200 people. She didn't say anything dramatic or accusatory. She just stood there, looking absolutely stunning and completely calm, and let people remember who she was. The silence stretched out for what felt like forever. I could see my ex's face from where I was sitting, confusion giving way to recognition, giving way to something that looked like panic. The groom had gone completely pale, his eyes darting between Claire and the exit like he was calculating escape routes. But the real drama was happening in the audience. I could literally watch the realization spread through the crowd like a wave. The whispered conversations, the knowing looks, the sudden understanding of why the timeline of this relationship had felt so compressed. Claire wasn't there to make a speech or cause a scene. Her presence was the statement. Then his father stood up. This was the twist none of us saw coming. Not Claire, not me, certainly not the happy couple at the altar. His father was a tall, distinguished man in his 70s who looked like he'd stepped out of a boardroom even in his wedding attire. He looked at his son, then at Claire, then back at his son. He didn't say anything either. He just walked out. That's when the real chaos started. The mother of the groom jumped up and followed her husband. Then some of the business associates started filing out. Within minutes, about half the wedding party was gone, leaving behind a confused officiant and a bride who looked like she might pass out. My ex finally found her voice and asked what was happening, why people were leaving. The groom tried to salvage the situation, talking about how this was their special day and how nothing else mattered except their love for each other. But you could see in his eyes that he knew it was over. Claire and I slipped out during the confusion. We didn't need to see the rest. Whatever happened next was between them and the aftermath of their choices. Later, through the same network of friends and acquaintances that had brought us together, we heard the full story. Turns out, his father's investment in the startup wasn't just about money, it was about trust. The old man had built his fortune on the principle that character matters, that how you treat people in private reflects who you really are. When he realized what his son had done, how he'd handled his previous relationship, the funding disappeared overnight. The wedding was called off somewhere between the ceremony and the reception. Most of the guests went home, though apparently a few diehards stayed for the expensive dinner that had already been paid for. As for Claire and me, we spent the rest of that evening at a diner about 20 miles away, still in our fancy clothes, eating pie and talking about what came next. We'd accomplished what we set out to do, not revenge exactly, but a kind of justice. The truth had a way of surfacing eventually, and sometimes it just needed a little help. I won't pretend that crashing their wedding fixed everything or made all my hurt disappear. Healing from betrayal isn't that simple. But it did something important. It reminded me that I hadn't been the problem. I hadn't been inadequate or lacking in ambition. I'd just been inconvenient to someone who was willing to lie and manipulate to get what they wanted. Claire and I stayed friends after that, bonded by our shared experience of being collateral damage in someone else's love story. She moved to a different city a few months later, started fresh somewhere new. I stayed put but started making changes of my own. New apartment, new routines, new ways of thinking about what I wanted from life. Sometimes people ask me if I regret what we did, if it was petty or vindictive or wrong. The truth is, I don't know. Maybe it was all of those things. But it was also honest in a way that their whole relationship wasn't. They built their happiness on a foundation of lies and betrayal, and foundations like that don't tend to last. The last I heard, they tried to make it work for a few more months, but the damage was done. The startup failed without his father's backing, the perfect fairy tale fell apart, and they both had to face the reality of who they'd become in pursuit of what they wanted. As for me, I learned something valuable about the difference between being left and being escaped from. Sometimes people leave relationships because they've outgrown them or found something better. But sometimes they escape from them because they can't face the person they become within them. My ex didn't leave me because I lacked ambition. She escaped from me because she couldn't face who she was becoming while she was planning her betrayal. That distinction matters more than I ever realized. I'm doing better now. Not perfect, not completely healed, but better. I've learned to trust my instincts again, to value honesty over convenience, to recognize the difference between someone who challenges me to grow and someone who makes me feel like I need to shrink. I've learned that being enough for the right person is more important than being everything for the wrong one. And sometimes, late at night when I'm feeling philosophical, I think about that moment in the barn when Claire stood up and the truth came flooding in. Not because she said anything dramatic or made a big speech, but because she simply existed in a space where lies were being celebrated. Sometimes that's all it takes. One person willing to be a reminder that the past can't be rewritten quite so easily. Truth has a way of surfacing eventually. Sometimes it just needs someone brave enough to stand up for it.